Last week, we made history by being the first media outlet in the world to take letters from the audience. Okay, maybe that's not true. I mean, we definitely answered questions from the audience, but we certainly weren't the first. In fact, there's a good chance we're the last, because answering audience questions has been a popular trend since the invention of the magazine. When you think about these letter to the editor sections, you probably imagine a bunch of fairly generic questions followed by cut and dry responses from an unnamed editor. That's certainly what you saw in the beginning with video game publications like Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Pro, and Nintendo Power. But as newsstands started to fill up with game regs, we began to see a strange phenomenon where the weird and fictitious lives of mail editors became more important than actually answering reader questions. Today I wanted to dig a little deeper into the secret lives and honor some of the most memorable mail editors that helped pave the way to where we are right now. I think the first time I paid attention to a mail editor was when Die Hard Game Fan introduced the Postmeister. He was a parody of a disgruntled postman, which had become an unfortunate national trend after a number of angry mailmen went on shooting sprees in the late 1980s. But don't worry, the Postmeister was mostly non-violent. But each issue did make it a point to single out that he's crazy. This allowed him to go off on a bunch of wild rants that you wouldn't see in other magazines. This was really the beauty of the Die Hard Game Fan letter section. The Postmeister would routinely pick questions and comments you wouldn't find anywhere else, especially when it came to letters bashing the competition, namely Electronic Gaming Monthly. This was a magazine with a chip on its shoulder, and there was no better place to see this than the letter section. But what's important to know is that Posty was a bit of a hero. He may have been labeled as crazy, but he wasn't mean-spirited. Going back and reading the responses now, it's honestly a little surprising to see how thorough he is in each question he answers. And compared to some of the other mail editors we're going to talk about, he comes across as relatively sane. Maybe a bit eccentric at times, but never certifiably insane. He was a genuinely good character, which is why he also showed up as a reoccurring part of Die Hard Game Fan's monthly Adventures of Monitor comic series. He was also one of the many reasons I loved this mag back in the 1990s. Now, what I didn't realize at the time was that this type of personality-driven mail editor was old hat over in England. By the time Die Hard Game Fan debuted their first issue, computers and video games, or if you prefer CVG, already had an aggressive loudmouth running their letter section. His name was Yob, and he was depicted as a punk with spiky hair and a penchant for torturing readers, both literally and figuratively. Described in some issues as a smelly old turd whiffing in the corner, Yobs Mailbag was a lot more combative than what we saw in the United States. Yob's gimmick was that he would insult the readers, which in turn prompted the readers to follow suit. The results ran the gamut, from being hilarious to being downright cringeworthy. Yob's responses were always better, of course, but every so often you'd find somebody that came out to play. It's this dynamic that makes the years of Mailbag installments worth going back to. He was always pretty good about eventually answering each question, but it usually came after he twisted that knife just enough to leave a mark. Speaking of British magazines that left a mark, Megatech also has an interesting tale to tell. They started out with your typical, boring letter section, just like everybody else. But a funny thing happened in 1993. They decided to ditch the traditional approach and try something a little more interesting. Let me introduce you to Tom's Island, a fun little spread that allowed mail editor Thomas Guise to use his creativity to help set the magazine apart. For example, in one issue, Tom explained that he got stranded on a deserted island after a fishing expedition went awry. Apparently, he not only explored a giant volcano, but also discovered dinosaurs and vegetation that had been extinct for 65 million years. So what did he do? He stole an egg and got off that island as quickly as possible, giving him just enough time to answer a few of your reader questions. Now, much like Yob, Tom was a bit standoffish with the readers. He was more sarcastic than mean-spirited, though his sense of humor was certainly biting. He also nearly got into a legal battle with Anthony Hopkins, whose lawyer contacted the magazine after an especially nasty joke. Oddly enough, that reminds me of the time Wes Studi's agent emailed me regarding an article I wrote about the Street Fighter movie, but that's a story for another day. The truth is, this kind of personality-driven mailbag section was incredibly rare back in the day. That's one of the main reasons why somebody like the Postmeister or Yob stood out. But we did see a lot of the more traditional magazines attempt their own gimmicks. Electronic Gaming Monthly, for example, started posting the Psycho Letter of the Month, which involved a whole lot of questionable content from people with a varying amount of mental health. Here we see a guy arguing that the word sex has been subliminally hidden in the Road Avengers advertising. And here's a ransom note to EGM threatening to kill Sonic the Hedgehog. Speaking of which, this letter right here argues that Mario Paint is actually more violent than Mortal Kombat. And then, of course, there's this letter that's all about spam. There was also the straight-laced Next Generation, who got in on the fun by continuing a long-running joke that involved a fair amount of violence. Every time a reader caught a mistake, they would kill the editor at fault in increasingly brutal ways. It all started in issue 48, when one of their critics was strangled to death and they got a wrestling fact wrong. A couple issues later, we found a critic pummeled with a blunt object for mistaking a Leisure Suit Larry sequel. In issue 50, an editor had his pinky chopped off with bolt cutters after he mixed up the Star Wars movies. The horror. This joke seemed to end in issue 54, when a last-minute policy change spared an editor from being ripped apart by wild dogs. Whether it's Yob's insults, the Post Meister's mental state, or Next Generation killing critics for making mistakes, it's clear the Mail editors were working through a lot of deep-seated trauma back in the 1990s. It was almost as if you needed to be a little nuts to want to read the thousands of letters they got every month. This was often the one part of the magazine where the editors could relax a little and just have fun. And you know, I think that's why I always loved reading them as a kid. If anything, the personality-driven approach we saw in these letter sections have seeped into every facet of the way we cover games in 2018. I wonder what Postmeister thinks about all this. Maybe I should write him a letter. Hey, thanks for watching us talk about the secret lives of Mail editors. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. So here's the question I have for you. What was your favorite part of video game magazines? I was always into the letters and reviews, but maybe you gravitated towards the previews and the cheats. I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, you should expect a brand new episode of the Defunct Games Mailbag next week, along with a bunch of new reviews and a new episode of Game Over. It's gonna be a busy week, so I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.